Ladies and gentlemen, let me start with a question that may sound simple, but has the power to shake the global financial system. What if the world's biggest economic chess move is already on board and most people are still watching the wrong pieces? History doesn't announce itself with headlines. It whispers first. And today, those whispers are coming from vaults, balance sheets, and bullion deep inside China. For decades, money has been backed not by gold but by trust. Trust in governments, trust in central banks, trust in printed paper and digital promises. But every system built purely on trust eventually faces a moment of truth. And what we are witnessing right now may be that moment. China, quietly and strategically, has been accumulating gold, not for decoration, not for tradition, but for leverage. And when a nation stockpiles real assets while the rest of the world prints liabilities, that is not coincidence. That is preparation. This is not just economics. This is financial warfare without tanks. Financial military parade where gold replaces missiles, reserves replace troops, and balance sheets replace battlefields. While the world debates interest rates and inflation numbers, China has been playing a deeper game. One that asks a dangerous question. What happens when confidence in fiat currencies cracks? Because when that happens, the world won't run to words or promises. It will run to gold. Think about this. Gold doesn't default, it doesn't inflate, it doesn't lie. Empires rise and fall, currencies come and go, but gold remains. And China understands this lesson better than most. If China were to reveal gold reserves far larger than officially declared, it would not just shock markets. It would challenge the dominance of the U.S. dollar, rewrite global trade dynamics, and signal a shift in financial power that happens once in a generation. But here's the real hook. This isn't about China alone. This is about you. Because every global reset, every currency shift, every monetary shock creates two groups of people, the prepared and the surprised. The wealthy don't panic in crises, they position themselves before them, they study patterns, not headlines. They understand that when the rules of the game change, those who adapt early don't just survive, they lead. We are living in an era where traditional financial education is no longer enough. Saving money in a depreciating currency is no longer safe. Blind trust is no longer smart. Awareness is the new currency. Knowledge is the new defense system. And courage, the courage to question, to learn, and to act, is the ultimate asset. So as China potentially prepares its checkmate move, ask yourself this. Are you watching the game, or are you learning how to play it? Because the future will not reward comfort. It will reward clarity. It will reward those who understand that real wealth is not built in moments of calm, but in moments of transition. Let me leave you with this. Every generation faces a defining financial moment. For some, it was the gold standard. For others, it was the dollar's rise. For us, it may be this very shift. And when history looks back, it won't ask who predicted it perfectly. It will ask who prepared bravely. The chessboard is set. The pieces are moving, and checkmate doesn't come with noise. It comes with certainty. The only question left is, will you be ready when the world realizes the game has changed? Gold has always played a unique role in the architecture of global finance, not because it promises growth, but because it promises certainty. Unlike fiat currencies, which derive value from policy decisions and public confidence, gold derives value from scarcity, permanence, and universal acceptance. When a nation deliberately accumulates gold at scale, it is not making a speculative bet. It is reinforcing the foundation of its monetary credibility. China's sustained and strategic gold purchases reflect a long-term vision centered on resilience, autonomy, and influence within an increasingly fragile global financial system. What makes this strategy especially powerful is its timing. The global economy is operating in an era of unprecedented debt, aggressive monetary expansion, and declining real purchasing power across major currencies. In such an environment, gold functions not merely as a hedge, but as a silent stabilizer. It does not react emotionally to markets, it does not rely on foreign institutions, and it cannot be diluted by policy error. By increasing its gold reserves, China is effectively insulating a portion of its national balance sheet from external shocks, sanctions risk, and currency volatility. That is not defensive behavior, it is strategic positioning. There is also a deeper signal embedded in gold accumulation that markets often underestimate. Gold is trust without permission. It requires no counterparty, no clearing system, and no geopolitical approval. In a world where financial access can be restricted overnight and reserves can be frozen with the stroke of a pen, gold represents financial independence in its purest form. China's actions suggest an understanding that future economic power will belong not to those who print the most money, but to those who control the most credibility. And credibility in times of stress is measured in tangible assets. Consider the psychological dimension of this move. If a major economic power demonstrates that its currency and reserves are increasingly anchored to real assets, global confidence dynamics begin to shift. Investors, central banks, and trading partners start reassessing what safe truly means. The mere possibility that China's gold holdings exceed official disclosures introduces uncertainty into existing monetary assumptions, and in global finance, perception alone can move markets before facts ever do. This strategy also creates optionality. Gold reserves do not force immediate action, but they enable future leverage. They can support alternative settlement systems, reinforce currency stability, or act as a credibility backstop during systemic crises. In chess terms, this is not a move aimed at instant victory. It is a positional advantage built patiently, quietly, and deliberately. While others rely on confidence that must be constantly maintained, China is accumulating confidence that simply exists. And in the long arc of economic history, that distinction has always mattered more than speed. For more than half a century, the dominance of the U.S. dollar has rested on a powerful combination of global trust, trade settlement necessity, and the absence of a credible alternative. The dollar did not become dominant because it was perfect, but because it was stable enough when the world needed an anchor. Yet dominance in finance is never permanent, it is conditional. It depends on confidence, discipline, and perception. When any of these begin to weaken, the system does not collapse overnight. It slowly invites challengers to step forward. China's potential revelation of substantially larger gold reserves directly intersects with this vulnerability. Gold-backed credibility introduces a contrast that fiat-based systems struggle to match during periods of high debt and persistent monetary expansion. If markets begin to believe that China holds a stronger tangible reserve position than previously acknowledged, the conversation shifts from ideology to arithmetic. Trust stops being abstract and becomes measurable, and in global finance, measurable trust is dangerously persuasive. The real challenge to dollar dominance does not require the dollar to fail. It only requires alternatives to become plausible. A currency does not lose reserve status in a dramatic announcement. It loses it gradually as trade partners diversify risk. Gold enhanced settlement mechanisms, bilateral trade agreements, and non-dollar clearing systems reduce exposure one transaction at a time. Each step may appear small, but collectively they erode monopoly power. History shows that no reserve currency collapses from attack. It fades as relevance disperses. There is also a geopolitical dimension that markets often underestimate. Dollar dominance grants the United States extraordinary leverage through sanctions, liquidity access, and financial infrastructure control. As more nations observe this power being used, the incentive to reduce dependence intensifies. China's gold strategy sends a quiet but potent message. Economic sovereignty is achievable. Gold does not rely on SWIFT, does not require correspondent banks, and does not recognize political pressure. That reality alone reshapes strategic thinking among emerging and even developed economies. Perhaps the most compelling hook lies in psychology rather than policy. If confidence in the dollar begins to be questioned, not rejected, but questioned, capital behavior changes. Central banks rebalance. Long-term Term contracts explore alternative settlement terms. Investors hedge not against collapse, but against transition. And transitions, not crises, are where the largest wealth reallocations occur. What makes this moment especially significant is that it is unfolding while the dollar remains strong on the surface. That is precisely when strategic challenges are most effective, when complacency is high and urgency is low. Gold-backed credibility does not need to replace the dollar to weaken its gravitational pull. It only needs to offer a second center of confidence. And once the world recognizes that there is more than one anchor, financial gravity begins to redistribute in ways that are slow, structural, and irreversible. Modern economic power is no longer projected through visible force, but through invisible architecture. The most decisive battles of the 21st century are not fought on borders, but within payment systems, reserve compositions, trade settlement frameworks, and access to liquidity. Financial warfare operates quietly, legally, and continuously, shaping outcomes long before political tension becomes public. In this environment, strength is measured not by military hardware, but by the ability to withstand pressure without capitulation. Gold, in this context, becomes a strategic instrument rather than a passive asset. What makes financial warfare so effective is that it targets dependence rather than territory. Sanctions, reserve freezes, and restricted access to global financial infrastructure expose a critical vulnerability in modern economies: reliance on external systems controlled by others. When assets can be rendered unusable by policy decisions, their true ownership becomes conditional. Gold operates outside this framework. It does not require permission, compliance, or digital validation. It exists beyond networks, beyond jurisdictions, and beyond political alignment. That independence gives it tactical value in a world where economic pressure is increasingly weaponized. China's approach reflects a clear understanding of this reality. By prioritizing tangible reserves alongside industrial and technological capacity, it reduces exposure to asymmetric financial pressure. This is not about preparing for confrontation, it is about eliminating leverage points. In strategic terms, the strongest position is not the one that threatens retaliation, but the one that cannot be easily coerced. Gold serves precisely that function. It strengthens balance sheets in ways that are immune to cyber risk, policy reversal, or institutional exclusion. The hook many observers miss is that financial warfare rewards patience, not aggression. Unlike military conflict, there is no starting signal, no declaration, and no clear end. Advantages accumulate silently. Each incremental reduction in vulnerability shifts the balance of power. Each additional ton of gold is not a headline, but a reinforcement. When pressure eventually arrives, whether through trade disputes, capital controls, or monetary tightening, the outcomes are already largely determined by prior preparation. There is also a signaling effect embedded in this strategy. When a nation demonstrates resilience to financial pressure, it changes how others calculate risk. Allies feel safer diversifying relationships. Neutral actors gain confidence in alternative systems. Even dominant players are forced to reconsider assumptions about control. This is how influence expands without confrontation. The battlefield remains calm, the markets remain open, yet strategic terrain quietly changes hands. In this new era, victory does not belong to those who act loudly, but to those who build quietly. Financial warfare is won long before it is recognized as such by nations that understand one simple truth. The most powerful weapon is not the ability to apply pressure, but the ability to endure it without bending. The modern fiat currency system is built on a promise that confidence will always be maintained, even as debt expands faster than productive growth. For decades, this promise has held, not because the system is flawless, but because alternatives were limited and coordination remained intact. Today, that balance is under strain. Persistent fiscal deficits, elevated sovereign debt levels, and repeated cycles of monetary easing have introduced structural fragility into currency systems that were once considered unshakable. The risk is no longer theoretical, it is embedded in the mechanics of how money is created and sustained. What makes fiat exposure particularly dangerous is its invisibility. Inflation does not arrive as a sudden event. It erodes purchasing power quietly, year after year, transferring wealth without headlines or alarms. Real yields turn negative, savings lose value, and balance sheets appear stable while real economic capacity weakens. This creates a paradox where markets function, yet long-term confidence deteriorates beneath the surface. The hook is simple but unsettling. A currency can be widely used and simultaneously losing credibility. Central banks face an increasingly narrow path. Tightening monetary policy risks destabilizing debt-heavy systems, while continued accommodation accelerates currency dilution. This constraint reduces policy flexibility and increases systemic vulnerability. When markets begin to sense that options are limited, volatility becomes structural rather than cyclical. In such an environment, the risk is not hyperinflation tomorrow, but normalization of erosion, where stability exists in appearance but not in substance. Fiat systems also depend heavily on global coordination. Reserve currencies function because participants agree to hold, trade, and settle in them. Once diversification begins, even gradually, the feedback loop weakens. Trade invoicing shifts, reserve allocations adjust, and hedging behavior changes. None of these actions require panic, they require prudence, and prudence, when practiced at scale, has transformative effects. The most destabilizing moments in financial history did not begin with collapse, they began with quiet reallocation. Gold exposes this vulnerability precisely because it has no policy risk. It cannot be printed to solve short-term problems, nor can it be devalued by political necessity. Its value emerges most clearly when confidence in paper systems becomes conditional. That is why increased attention to hard assets often coincides with periods of monetary stress. It is not a rejection of fiat currencies, but a recognition of their limitations. The deeper hook lies in timing. Risk in fiat systems is highest not during crisis, but during prolonged calm that relies on extraordinary measures. When stability requires constant intervention, it is no longer organic. It is managed, and managed systems, however sophisticated, eventually reveal their constraints. The question is never whether adjustment will occur, but who recognizes the exposure before the adjustment becomes unavoidable. Large-scale shifts in the global monetary landscape rarely announce themselves with urgency, yet their consequences are far-reaching for those responsible for allocating capital and shaping policy. When signals emerge that the foundations of trust, reserves, and settlement mechanisms may evolve, investors and policymakers are forced into a reassessment that goes beyond short-term performance metrics. The strategic question is no longer how markets behave next quarter, but how credibility is preserved over the next decade. That shift in time horizon is where most decision makers either gain an edge or fall behind. For investors, a changing reserve dynamic challenges traditional portfolio assumptions. Asset allocation models built during eras of stable dollar dominance may underestimate currency risk and overestimate liquidity permanence. When confidence begins to fragment, diversification is no longer about return optimization. It becomes about resilience. Capital starts favoring assets with intrinsic value, low counterparty exposure, and global acceptability. The hook here is subtle but powerful. In transitional periods, the safest assets are not always the most familiar ones. Policymakers face an even more complex dilemma. Reserve management is not merely an accounting exercise, it is a strategic signal. Adjusting reserve composition sends messages to markets, allies, and adversaries alike. A gradual shift toward gold or alternative assets reflects prudence without provocation, yet delay carries its own risk. Holding excessive exposure to depreciating currencies erodes national balance sheets in real terms, reducing future policy flexibility. In this sense, inaction can be as consequential as action. There is also a coordination challenge that magnifies the impact of early movers. When a few central banks begin diversifying, others are compelled to evaluate similar strategies to avoid relative disadvantage. This dynamic creates momentum without formal agreement. What begins as risk management evolves into structural change. History shows that reserve transitions are rarely synchronized. They are staggered, uneven, and driven by those willing to move before consensus forms. For both investors and policymakers, the most valuable asset in such periods is not prediction, but adaptability. Static frameworks struggle in environments defined by shifting anchors. Flexibility in strategy, openness to non-traditional signals, and willingness to challenge legacy assumptions separate effective decision-making from complacency. The real hook lies in this reality. By the time a new system feels obvious, the strategic advantage has already been claimed. This moment rewards those who understand that global finance is not static, but evolutionary. Capital and policy respond not to declarations, but to incentives and risk. Those who reassess early are not betting on disruption. They are positioning for continuity under new conditions. And in a world where monetary credibility is increasingly contested, positioning itself becomes a form of power.